Welcome to the Human Journey channel, where we'll be looking into the ancient history of mankind. We will also be covering subjects on myths, conspiracy theories, unexplained stories that have captivated the human mind for millennia. Please like, subscribe, and share. What do you think of when you hear the words Easter Island? Maybe you think of a remote island in the Pacific Ocean with the eerie 900 gigantic stone figures resting on massive stone pedestals. However, perhaps like some of the first explorers who ventured upon Easter Island, you may wonder how it was possible to construct and move such megaton monuments. Who built them? And why? And whatever happened to the inhabitants of Easter Island? Easter Island, or as modern natives call it, Rapa Nui, is actually in the territory of Chile, South America. It is recognized as being one of the most remote inhabited places in the world. The island is 2,200 miles away from Chile in the Pacific Ocean. The only way to get there is by a 5-hour plane flight. The island itself is actually very small, being only 15.3 miles by 7.6 miles in size. Now, Easter Island was discovered on Easter Sunday 1722 by the Dutch Admiral Jacob Roggeveen, hence why he christened the island Easter Island. It became quickly apparent to the Dutch explorers that they were not the first people to discover the island. In fact, archaeology supports the island being inhabited from about the 5th century AD. Once landing on the island, they were surprised to find a very passive people with varying skin colours. They were brown, white and red-skinned, and they were bowing down at the feet of giant stone figures. The Dutch Admiral Roggeveen was so struck by the huge statues that he even mentioned them in his journal. To quote, "These stone images at first caused us to be struck with astonishment, because we could not comprehend how it was possible that these people, who are devoid of any heavy thick timber for making any machines, as well as strong ropes, nevertheless had been able to erect such images which were fully 30 feet high and thick in proportion." However, on closer inspection, he considered the statues to be forgeries made of clay. After only a few hours and a skirmish with the locals, the Dutch fleet left, never to return. But in that short time, they had put Easter Island on the map and giving the island its famous name. Nearly 50 years later, in October 1770, a Spanish fleet left from Peru to sail to Easter Island. After 2 weeks, they reached the island, and one of the first tasks they did was to raise 3 crosses to establish the religion of Christianity. However, the Spanish Peruvians had another motive for going to Easter Island, and that was to make the island part of Spanish Peru and under its rule. They did this by making the islanders sign away the island to Peru. Of course, the islanders had no idea what they were signing, but now Easter Island was officially part of Spanish Peru. Just a few years after this, in 1774, the infamous Captain James Cook arrived at the island. With the use of a translator from Tahiti, Cook was able to converse with the islanders. But the language of the people was so difficult to translate that little was learned. However, now it was becoming clear that the islanders were beginning to change socially. They had now started carrying weapons and were looking malnourished. Clearly food was in short supply, and the population had been decimated from thousands to a mere 700 people. Cook put this population reduction down to the island's volcano, speculating that an eruption had taken place. Interestingly, many of the statues that originally had been worshipped by the islanders were now toppled over and broken. Captain Cook concluded that these islanders had nothing to do with the statues and did not consider them sacred. He said, "They must have been a work of immense time, and sufficiently show the ingenuity and perseverance of the islanders in the age in which they were built. For the present inhabitants have most certainly had no hand in them, and they do not even repair the foundations of those which are going to decay." Interestingly, 12 years later, a French expedition to the island found that there was actually a rather large population of islanders, approximately 2,000, and there was no longer any famine. The islanders were well fed, and there were no signs of social discourse among the people. The French concluded that when Captain Cook visited the island, most of the islanders hid themselves in caves. Maybe this was because on previous visits to the island, raiders may have come and taken them as slaves. Now in 1886, an American team of scientists surveyed Easter Island and found that there were approximately 900 statues. This is when the Rapa Nui name for the statues became the official name used, and that is Moai, which basically means images or statues. So that's the history of the island. But what do we know about the Moai or the statues themselves? Well, the statue sizes vary from 6 to 33 feet high, weighing up to 90 tons. However, there is an unfinished statue recently discovered that would have been 70 feet tall and weighed approximately 290 plus tons. Nearly all the statue's dimensions and characteristics remain almost identical, with a long head and torso, arms tight at the side, with hands resting on the lower part of the stomach. Some had eyes and others red stone on top of the heads, which may have been a hat or hair. Archaeologists date the statues as being carved between the 13th and 15th centuries. However, some people believe they are much older, even going back to the last ice age, 10 to 15,000 years. But this is a very controversial theory with little evidence. Now when we look at the Moai, we may think that they are just a load of carved heads on an island. However, excavations in May 2012 discovered that the Moai are not only heads, but they also had bodies buried under the ground. This is seen by the few statues that were put on pedestals facing the sea in the sacred place of Aku Akivi. Many of the other Moai were put on platforms in rows, and these would face towards the interior of the island, likely watching over the inhabitants like giant sentinels. The villagers probably considered them as protectors. Now nearly all the statues are made of a material called tuff, which is compressed volcanic ash. This makes sense as the island has a dormant volcano and there is plenty of this material lying around. So documenting and describing the Moai was one thing, but discovering how the statues were constructed and moved was proving very difficult. The problem that archaeologists were having was that they couldn't figure out how a small population of only a few thousand could build, construct and move 900 statues that weighed many tons. Of course, some conspiracy theorists say that aliens made the Moai, and however amazing that sounds, all evidence clearly points to human construction from the abundant materials found on the island. So then, how did the islanders move the statues into position many miles from their original location? Archaeologists have tried to reconstruct how the ancient islanders were able to move the giant statues. In one test, they were able to move a 10-ton replica a few hundred feet using ropes and literally wobbling or walking the statue forward. Interestingly, the Rapa Nui folklore belief was that the statues magically walked into their present position. So this use of ropes and manpower walking the statues was the most likely and provable way of moving the Moai. Another question, however, is how such a relatively small group of people managed to make nearly 900 statues. Well, recent studies have indicated that at the peak of the island's population, there may have been as many as 17 to 18,000 inhabitants at any one time, which is easily enough to make the many statues, which may have taken even up to a year to construct just one Moai. So then, what happened to the people of Easter Island? Even though the population was healthy, unfortunately the construction of the stone monuments had by the 19th century drastically declined. This was most likely due to the forest being decimated in previous constructions. This led to the most popular theory that the inhabitants of the island had committed ecocide, which is the overuse of natural resources until it becomes unsustainable. The theory is that the island was covered in trees and palms, but in order to grow crops along with the construction and moving of the Moai, all the trees were cut down and not allowed to be replenished. The theory suggests that due to lack of food and resources, the islanders turned to tribal warfare and possibly even cannibalism. However, this theory has very little evidence apart from a lack of trees. The reality is that the Rapa Nui people were very experienced farmers, which are an essential part of surviving on a remote island, of which the islanders had already done for well over 1,000 years. Evidence points to the farmers even fertilizing the ground with volcanic ash for better crop yield. There is an Easter Island story, however, that due to a lack of resources, there would be a yearly competition or trial. A representative of each of the island's tribes would have to swim out to one of the small islands of Rapa Nui through shark-infested waters and wait there to get the first Manatura egg or tern egg, of which was sacred to the islanders. The first person to get back to Easter Island with the egg would be crowned the Birdman, which was a great honour, and his chief and tribe would get the first choice of the island's food and resources, whilst the rest was distributed among the people. So why today are so few people inhabiting Easter Island, the majority of which are from South America and not the original natives? Well, the population decreased on a major scale only when the island was discovered by Western explorers. As mentioned earlier, history points to slave raids by the South Americans throughout the 19th century. Nearly all the islanders who were taken as slaves died within a year of capture. Now, another unseen danger to the Rapa Nui Islanders was disease. As explorers and raiders came to the island, they brought disease with them, of which the Western people had built up immunity to. However, unfortunately for the islanders, they had no immunity to these new diseases, and the population was decimated so intensely that it was reduced to only 111 people by the end of the 19th century. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video on the history of Easter Island. Please subscribe, comment and share, and again, thanks for watching.